We're going to be picking on inspiring philosophy today. His real name's Michael Jones, and I'm just going to say Jones from now on because it's so much easier to say. The setup to this is he made this video, and I thought it was so deceptive and so ahistorical that I made 2 videos addressing it. Wasn't particularly nice, but that's because I just have no respect for dishonesty. Before we go on, I'm going to say some nice things. I think Jones is extremely intelligent. I think he's very knowledgeable. I think he's a pretty good debater. If you haven't seen his video where he debated Kent Hovind on can a Christian believe in evolution, essentially, you should watch it because he wiped the floor with Kent very well. I have also learned from Jones. I've been guilty in the past of saying things to the effect of, the reason the Dark Ages were called the Dark Ages is because of Christianity. Jones does a lot of work pushing back against that, and I listened to what he had to say with an open mind, and I'm pretty much on his side. I don't say things like that anymore. I don't know if he really had much to do with this, but in my second book that I just pretty much finished writing, called Facts That Aren't True, I do have some biblical stuff in there, but I decided that I should be charitable and put some things in there that are favorable toward Christianity. So I did this entire pretty long, extensive piece debunking the myth that Christianity just took all of its customs and beliefs and whatever from other religions. Funny enough, I got most of the information from that from a Dan McClellan video. I didn't get any of that information from Jones himself, but I like to think that Jones would be proud of me for that. Here's how we're going to do this. I made 2 videos. The first one's about 5 minutes long. The second one's 10 minutes long. I'm going to just play those videos right now so you have the context and the setup, because he did a response video, and his response video is terrible. So you're going to hear the entire counter argument from me. Then we're going to go through his response video, and I'm going to address everything. There's going to be an opportunity for me to expand on some more context behind the things I was saying as well. But there's just so much to pick at from what he was able to come up with. So here are my 2 videos.
In trying to increase literacy rates.
Literacy rates, was that before or after they were burning books for containing information they deemed to be heretical?
Okay. This is just modern mythology. Christians in the Middle Ages were not rampantly burning books.
Your new name is Inspiring Sophistry, because the amount of deception and flat out lies, or maybe you're just ignorant, is profound. Did you burn books? We didn't rampantly burn books. If you thought he was even going to take partial accountability, oh no.
Bart Ehrman says during the days of Constantine, there were no imperial book burnings.
2,000 years of Christian history, and let's zoom in on a 65-year period. Yes, Your Honor, my client took the life of that person the other day, but when he was 5 years old, he didn't. Huh? This is a trick he plays, putting up quotes that he knows his followers won't read or even think about, because he doesn't need to convince them of anything. He just needs to give off the illusion of doing something. He once countered the claim I made that the world has become less embroiled in war and has become more prosperous as it has become more secular, with saying,
Christianity has been shown to lead to positive outcomes in multivariate analyses.
I zoomed in on the papers he threw up on the screen, and they were about comparing high school GPAs in Christian and non-Christian schools. Your Bart Ehrman book there, you can find that online. I read the whole chapter. It's addressing the myth that Constantine had a role in deciding biblical canon. Again, here's the narrative he spun. Claim: Christians historically burned books they deemed heretical. Response: Nuh-uh, Constantine didn't burn any Gospels. Pope Leo ordered the burning of the Maccabean writings just a few decades after Constantine. We're just ignoring the complete destruction, save for 2 examples, probably because they couldn't find them, of all known Aztec and Mayan manuscripts on the order of Bishop Diego de Landa. Here's a really good book on that if you want to read it. Don't pay any attention to the burning of 10,000 Hebrew manuscripts the church found blasphemous in 1242, because Constantine didn't burn any Gospels 900 years earlier.
Christians continued to use the classical works and teach them throughout the medieval period. The historian Helena Schrader said, "No knowledge was lost even in the West, and in the East there were no destructions of libraries until the Ottoman conquest."
This is, I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot the deputy. Except glossing over the fact that you shot the sheriff. Was the medieval period the ass-backwards, flat earth cesspool that some people think it was? No, but you're ducking the claim they did X by saying, oh, well, what about Y?
If you want to get the real history, you can read this article by the historian James Hannum.
Remember, there's been zero concession or admission of banning or burning any texts that Christians don't like. We've only been told of one example of one guy not doing it, and then we were told the classics survived thanks to monks and scribes making copies. The narrative of what the real history is has been front-loaded by him to his listener, and it's a narrative that the history of Christianity is one of innocence. It's not. We're not saying most Christians, or most of the time, or most books. Nobody ever made that claim. But you are deceptively peddling a narrative of absolution. And I already know what the strategy to respond to this is going to be because I've seen it before. I never said Christians never did blank. Not bringing it up was a deliberate and calculated PR stunt. Instead, you deflected. It's just so incredibly dishonest. And to finish with, in the words of James Hannum, you know, the guy who you just said can give us the real story? Yes, Christians have destroyed heretical works. There's going to be a part 2 because Inspiring Sophistry's video somehow gets even worse. Now, he responds to both videos with just one video. It's 9 minutes long. For a TikTok video, that's an eternity. Maybe he doesn't think I'm worth it. Maybe he doesn't care too much. But this is woefully inadequate. That's a problem because what it does is it invites really heavy criticism on you didn't address blank, and that happened in the first place, and you're gonna see the way he deflects on that. Let's just get into it. Our new name is Inspiring Sophistry because the amount of deception and flat out lies, or maybe you're just ignorant, is profound. I like his music. I don't know if he does this on his computer. I pretty much do all my TikTok videos just on my phone, but it's cool.
Aw, that's cute. I've never heard that one before. Did you think of that all by yourself?
Yeah, I did. I think Inspiring Sophistry is pretty good because philosophy, sophistry, that's catchy. The wordplay works.
So, sophistry is the use of fallacious arguments, especially with the intent of deceiving.
Yes, and I think I laid out a pretty clear case that that's what was going on.
Pointless Peterson is never actually able to demonstrate that I lied.
Sort of. Intent is the hardest thing to prove, but what I stated very clearly was you deliberately left out the fact that they did burn books and explicitly only used an example of somebody who didn't burn books to peddle the narrative of absolution. Now, I can't read your mind. You're right. But I think that's the most obvious interpretation there. But I did also say it may be because of ignorance. The lies and ignorance part, that's actually mostly in relation to the Galileo things. And what he's stitching there was my very first video. Now, he couldn't know that that's what I was thinking in my head. Absolutely, whatever.
Which we'll get to in a minute. But by the way, since we're giving each other cute little nicknames, that's yours. Because you added no substance to this conversation.
Yeah, Pointless Peterson, it's not catchy. There's no wordplay there. Planet Peterson already has alliteration, so the PP part, I'm giving you like 3 out of 10 for that. Did you burn books? We didn't rampantly burn books. If you thought he was even going to take partial accountability, oh no.
So you've already debunked yourself because you just admitted I didn't lie because
what?
I never said Christians never burned books. I even cited...
So if we remember, the way he said it actually wasn't the way I said it. He said, this is a myth. Christians were not rampantly burning books. To me, that sounds like you're strawmanning the other person's argument because they didn't say you were rampantly burning books. It's mafia, lawyer, politician doublespeak. You say something in a way where you can claim, like, I don't know, what we call is plausible deniability, or like, whoa, hey, I didn't literally say that we never did.
This article which says that it did happen at times, but that wasn't the norm.
Now, you can say the source that I cited brought up the fact that Christians had burned books, but again, at no point ever did you say that it ever happened. The only thing you talked about was that Constantine didn't do it. You spoon-fed your audience only information about the opposite of the claim. No accountability was taken. That is deception. I'm not going to bicker over who's being more pedantic, you or I. Deception, lie, same thing or not. It doesn't really matter. But again, it was the Galileo stuff where you said things that are just not true.
You're conveniently not telling your audience that I was responding to someone who made the ridiculous claim that Christians engaged in a
violent near-global campaign of cultural erasure.
So in my 2 replies to him, I was adding context to show that that premise was utter nonsense.
That premise is not nonsense because that did happen. Don't conflate the historical fact that it happened with the other person claiming it was most Christians most of the time. It did happen. I'm currently reading this book called Last Days of the Inca Empire. Spanish conquistadors were given a script handed down from them by the Pope that they were to read to people that they were just assuming control over, telling them the Pope, by the grace and glory of God himself, has given this land to the Spanish. You are conquered. Submit, and we will take you in peacefully. Resist, and, well, we know how that went. Historical facts aside, he's still bullshitting. Do you notice how this part
engaged in a
violent near-global campaign of cultural erasure?
So in my
didn't occur at all in the stitch that I did, because that wasn't part of the context. The part where this guy said he was burning books happens in like the first 10 seconds of his video. He said Christians weren't rampantly burning books. I addressed the fact that that's not true. The thing he says that is part of the context occurs 2 minutes later in his video. It occurs completely after the Galileo part, and it has nothing to do with book burning. Here's where that quote from that other creator comes from.
Why pick on Christianity?
Because it's impossible not to. See, if you spend the better part of a millennia engaging in a violent near-global campaign of cultural erasure, taking other people's stories, their iconography, their symbolic imagery, and superimposing your Christian ideology on top of it, you paint everybody else into a corner, creating a situation where humans can't engage in human culture without stepping on your toes. And now you're like, why does everyone keep stepping on our toes?
What did that have to do with book burning? Nothing at all. Jones responded to the guy by saying this:
cultural erasure.
So this is a caricature of a complicated history where Christians were spending most of their times peacefully spreading the gospel and trying to increase literacy rates.
Now it shifts to the quote that we actually heard from that guy.
Literacy rates, was that before or after they were burning books for containing information they deemed to be heretical?
I was adding context to show that that premise was utter nonsense.
Now, we have a little bit of a mess here, but this is what has happened. There's been an exchange between Jones and this guy. It's been a back and forth exchange. It's a tennis match. This guy said Christians engaged in cultural erasure. Jones said, no, they didn't do that, and also during this time they were copying books and increasing literature rates. To which the guy responds, they burned books. To which Jones responds with, they didn't rampantly burn books, etc. Here's what Jones is trying to get us to believe.
Of cultural erasure.
So in my 2 replies to him, I was adding context to show that that premise was utter nonsense. Christians were responsible for preserving a large amount of ancient literature. It's odd you left that context out.
I don't see that at all here. Jones is acting like his response was this grand narrative where he takes the thing he said about cultural erasure and book burning, etc., and lumped it all into one. When in reality, you made the claim about Christians copying books and then defended the book burning by saying they didn't burn books, and then responded to the historical fact about burning books with not acknowledging it on separate occasions. Each of your responses had its own context. All of that aside, you are the one that didn't acknowledge any book burning at all.
Bart Ehrman says during the days of Constantine, there were no imperial book burning.
2,000 years of Christian history. And let's zoom in on a 65-year period.
You know full well that was not the only reference I gave, nor did I say it represented all of Christian history.
Yes, that was the only example you gave. I didn't leave anything out in your video. His original video is like 10 minutes long, but like the second half of it is all just about the other guy talking about Christianity, borrowing stuff from pagans or whatever. Irrelevant. I included your other mentions of other sources. So what he's doing here is pretending that that's the only claim he made that I addressed, as if I left out context. No, Jones, I included everything in your video. There's an entire thing about book burning that your video begins with. I didn't skip any of it. Then your video transitions to Galileo. I didn't skip any of that. So no, I didn't leave anything out, and your additional sources don't address anything about book burning. The reason I specifically only focused on 2,000 years of history, focusing on the reign of Constantine, is because that's the only part where you addressed anything about book burning and said Constantine didn't burn books.
I gave 4 references. The first one showed that when Christians got power, they didn't go around burning books. The second showed they continued to teach the classical works,
which I mentioned in my video.
The third showed that they preserved the knowledge of the ancients,
which I mentioned in my video. I included the part of your video where you said this in my video. I didn't leave anything out.
And the last was for anyone who wanted more information on this complex history.
And I didn't leave that out either.
That I didn't have time to cover in a short video. You just took things out of context to push your propaganda.
Again, I included everything in your video on this topic. Was the medieval period the ass-backwards, flat earth cesspool that some people think it was? So what Jones has done here is with my video, he took the part where I said the thing about Constantine, and then he completely glossed over everything where I talked about Christians burning the 12,000 manuscripts from the Tanakh and the complete destruction of all Aztec and Mayan manuscripts. He completely glossed over all of that and then skipped to the end here where I make these points about the medieval period. Once again, not making his audience aware of these book burnings. No.
Good. We agree. Why are you wasting all of our time with this pointless response? Remember,
my response was not pointless. It was actually very comprehensive. You've just deliberately chose not to include huge sections of what I said, whereas I didn't cut anything out of your video.
I was responding to was giving that impression, and I was showing that was nonsense.
We're not saying most Christians, or most of the time, or most books. Nobody ever made that claim.
The guy I was responding to was making those claims.
No, he never made that claim. He never said most Christians. He never said most of the time. He said there was a global erasure campaign, and there was. By all means, say that it was just the conquistadors. Say it was just the Catholic Church. Say a few bad apples don't spoil the bunch. But you're just denying history.
Why are you not telling your audience the full context?
I think I've gone over pretty clearly that there's no missing context. And the context he ginned up was A, not relevant or included in the pieces I was responding to, and B, reimagines the series of events. He lumped 2 different contexts into this one thing and claiming that his entire response was to all of those ideas put together. Again, intent is the hardest thing to, prove or whatever. And when you make shorter videos for the internet, you leave stuff out. It's completely possible that I'm taking a less than charitable interpretation of this, but what I'm not misinterpreting is you leaving out the facts. You've continued leaving out the facts here. And I already know what the strategy to respond to this is going to be because I've seen it before.
Here comes the gaslighting.
I never said Christians never did blank. That's not gaslighting. Not bringing it up was a deliberate and calculated PR stunt.
No.
It's kind of funny because he didn't include what I'm saying he didn't bring up in here. So his audience doesn't know what I'm talking about.
Oh, it was about responding to a guy making outlandish claims that even you reject.
No, I don't reject his claims, and I don't think your claims are a fair interpretation of his claims either. This guy never said most Christians most of the time. Now, maybe he thinks that, but he didn't say that. But for the millionth time, you never once acknowledged that any book burnings have happened, and you've continued leaving out those details that I brought up in your response video here.
Since you're deliberately taking this out of context for your hit piece, you're the one engaging in a PR stunt.
No, I'm just telling the truth. I'm not defending a worldview or an institution. I mean, you could say I'm defending science when I go over the Galileo piece, but no. And I don't even know who that creator is. I don't care or anything. I'm not doing damage control for him. This is not a PR stunt. In the words of James Hannum, you know, the guy who you just said can give us the real story? Yes, Christians have destroyed heretical works.
Yeah, now read the rest of that. Nonetheless, deliberate destruction is only a minor element of why most ancient books are no longer extant.
You didn't acknowledge that it ever happened. You never acknowledged it. The only thing you said was during Constantine, no burnings happened. I hate repeating myself, but you keep not addressing that fact.
And in the article, he points out Christians played a huge role in preserving ancient works.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. They still, so I think I went over this in my video, but they preserved, like, you know, works from philosophers, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Socrates, whatever. Well, not Socrates, but Plato. If they burn 100,000 manuscripts and copy 1,000,000 manuscripts, you still got to acknowledge that they burned 100,000 manuscripts, which you never did. I guess I kind of forced the hand here, so, I mean, good.
It's ironic, really. You're accusing me of not telling my audience the full picture, and here you are doing the exact same thing. No. You can't even tell your audience what the full quote says.
I don't know how much more clear I could be. Claim Christians burned books that they deemed to be heretical. You did not acknowledge that at all. I'm pointing out that it did happen, and now you're sitting here planting your flag on the anthill that you have claimed is your victory, saying that because it only played a minor role, it's not that big of a deal or something. That's not the point. The point is you didn't acknowledge it.
And so far, you've not demonstrated one lie I've told, but you've taken what I've said wildly out of context.
No, I have not. Now we're moving on to my second video.
Was it before or after Galileo was sentenced to lifelong house arrest for claiming that the Earth revolved around the sun because that contradicted dogma?
That is also a modern myth.
Even if this isn't a lie, even if you just didn't do your homework, it's unforgivable. It's like saying there are 48 states. If you somehow didn't know, you can't look for this stuff and not find the right answer, unless you only look inside the halls of echo chambers. We will go into much more detail later, but let's just pause right here. Claim: Galileo was put on house arrest for contradicting dogma. Response: that's a myth. Fact: on the approval of the Pope, all books endorsing a Copernican model were banned on account of them being, quote, contrary to the Holy Scripture. Here is part of the actual sentence that Galileo was given. We declare that you, Galileo, have rendered yourself vehemently suspect by this holy office of heresy. That is to say, that you believe and hold the false doctrine, and contrary to the holy and divine Scripture, that the earth does move and is not the center of the world. He was tried for heresy. The end. Now here's Inspiring Sophistry's revisionist historical narrative and scientifically illiterate alternative explanation.
Galileo was teaching the Copernican model, which said the planets went around the sun in perfect circles. There is no physics to explain how that could be possible.
Nor does it need to be. A model may be nothing more than an accurate representation of the world. There was no physics to explain how Newtonian gravity worked for well over 200 years until general relativity. The equations were just declarative statements about what we observe. So is the Copernican model. And the Copernican model is extremely accurate. Here's Mars' orbit. Here's a perfect circle over top of it. You can't tell the difference because while the orbits are elliptical, they are extremely slight in their eccentricity. The difference between the semi-minor and major axis is about 0.4%. Mercury is the most eccentric planet, but the difference is still only 2.4%. Remember, the church's position was not that the Copernican model was inaccurate, but that it was heretical. This is the hardest point to make, but it's the most important. Heretical means it doesn't matter how true or accurate the model is. Scripture is the ultimate authority.
Most people don't realize this, but at the time, the science was on the church's side.
I don't know what this could possibly mean, and there was no elaboration. There was just throwing up of books, as if the cover of a book is an argument. But we've seen that before. Geocentric models could accurately predict things like moon phases, eclipses, and the solar calendar. That's because the Earth-Moon system is geocentric, and relatively speaking, you can treat the Sun-Earth center as geocentric too. If that's what the science backed up the church means, that sun and moon observations can work with a geocentric dogma, then okay. But geocentrism fails everywhere else, which is why it has these ridiculous epicycles to explain planetary retrograde, and the hilarious Tychonian system, with the planets orbiting the sun, but the sun orbiting the Earth. Now ask yourself, why was Tycho a famous and prolific astronomer? He wasn't toiling and dwelling in the underground. He was well known. Why was he not condemned and put on trial for his scientifically false model? Because the church never cared about physics or the science. Tycho's system upheld the dogma.
Galileo got in trouble because he was teaching the Copernican model as if it was a proven fact, when it was only an hypothesis.
Let's pretend this isn't false, which it is. The church has the authority to put somebody in house arrest for personally believing and publicly stating hypothesized scientific ideas that it deems aren't yet proven. That's logical, moral. The Galileo story is complicated. It spans 2 decades, but here are the details that matter. According to the church, Galileo was not given a soft ban on heliocentrism, but instead was ordered in 1616 to abstain altogether from teaching or defending this position and even from discussing it. Why such a strict prohibition? Because Pope Paul V ordered Cardinal Bellarmine to inform Galileo that heliocentrism is, quote, contrary to the Holy Scriptures. In 1633, Galileo was put on trial chiefly for publishing his fictional book, Dialogue Concerning the Chief Two World Systems, which is a long argument between two fictional characters who have this discussion about what makes more sense, a motionless Earth or an Earth that goes around the sun. At Galileo's trial, the Inquisition actually tried to get Galileo to testify against himself. That's illegal under canon law, or was illegal under canon law at the time. It probably still is. The Inquisition accused Galileo of disobeying his orders from Cardinal Bellarmine by referring to their copy of Bellarmine's letter. He wasn't allowed to even speak about heliocentrism. Wait a minute. IP said Galileo got in trouble for
teaching the Copernican model as if it was a proven fact.
That's because Galileo brought with him to trial the actual letter from nearly 20 years prior, which did say that Galileo had permission to talk about the Copernican system, just not to declare it as fact. Apologists use this part of the story, but then get the reason he was sentenced wrong, falsely acclaim Galileo of disobeying orders, and completely gloss over that, according to the church, he wasn't allowed to speak about it at all. We'll never know if the church faked that letter that they had, but the fact is he was accused, tried, and sentenced for heresy, and his book was a fictional narrative. One character in his book defends a position, the other character in the book defends the dogma. If the real story is he was allowed to talk about it in hypothetical terms, there's nothing wrong with his book. He was not sentenced because he published heliocentrism as a declared fact, but because, quote, you should be ordered by the commissary of the Holy Office to relinquish it, not to teach it to others, nor defend it, nor even mention it. And in default of acquiescence, that you should be imprisoned. At his trial, the Inquisition went on to say, because of the publication of his fictional book, quote, the false opinion of the earth's motion is daily gaining ground, and that you labor to induce the belief is undecided and express it as probable, which is equally a very grave error, since an opinion can in no way be probable which has been already declared and finally determined contrary to the scripture. That, right there, is the ultimate defeater. Explicitly, they declared that no one is allowed to hold the opinion that the earth orbits the sun. Can't be probable if it's contrary to scripture. There's no talking about it hypothetically or waiting for better science. It's declared wrong now and forever. The end.
When elliptical models could be developed from the work of Newton and Kepler, the church accepted it with ease, because the physics advanced enough to support it.
Advanced? Galileo's trial occurred decades after Kepler published his laws. You have the order of events wrong, but just listen to this dribble. Kepler's observations advanced our understanding enough to support a sun-centered model, which would mean the church had no right to condemn Galileo for advocating one. We are flailing in the wind at this point. The church accepted with ease. The church didn't formally accept heliocentrism until 1822, 213 years after Kepler published his laws of planetary ellipses. Newton's contributions were important, but it just solidified the observations into equations. The observations don't require an equation to prove that our eyes aren't lying to us. Copernicus developed his model based on what the most parsimonious way to describe what he observed in the sky was. That is exactly what Kepler did, although Kepler's math was better. And yet it's still irrelevant, because if Copernicus was wrong for the reasons the church stated, so was Kepler. It's not about what can be shown or measured, it's about what's heretical. It wasn't until centuries had passed and a bunch of grumpy old geezers who died could be replaced with people slightly open to newer ideas that the dogma was undone. Fact, on the approval of the Pope, all books endorsing a Copernican model were banned on account of them being, quote, contrary to the Holy Scripture.
Now you're only telling your audience a half-truth. Galileo's opponents would have been fine reinterpreting scripture if Galileo could prove his Copernican model. He couldn't, so they didn't think it was necessary to reinterpret scripture at that time.
Again, this thing about the church saying, well, your science, which arguably didn't even exist before Galileo, doesn't back up the Copernican model, is so beside the point for so many reasons. I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but according to Galileo, the orbits were circular, not elliptical, and that's wrong. The Ptolemaic system that the church held to was a model of circular orbits. It placed the Earth in the middle and everything orbiting the Earth doing so in perfect circles. If the church won't accept an incorrect model, why were they using the model that they had? Because their model made Earth special. I don't think Jones brings up this quote from Galileo's sentencing, but here's the other reason it doesn't matter. The Inquisition told him, an opinion can in no way be probable which has already declared and finally determined contrary of the divine scriptures. If Galileo had gone to the church with a Copernican model with elliptical orbits, they would have rejected it. Circular orbits was not the dogma. The dogma was not over circular orbits, although funny enough, the dogma asserted or held to circular orbits. The dogma was the position of Earth relative to other planets and the sun. No evidence contrary to that dogma would be accepted. Eventually they did accept it. Again, that was after decades and decades and decades of unrelenting having the proof stuffed in their faces.
An expert in the Galileo affair says this.
Roberto Bellarmino is an Italian, sort of read Foscarini's letter and he wrote a reply. And it's one of the most brilliant pieces of diplomatic compromise between theology and science that's ever been written. He's a very, very intelligent, very open-minded man.
Yeah.
What he basically says, look, we've got this situation. You have a theory, you have a hypothesis for which there is absolutely no proof.
There was nothing but proof of a heliocentric model. The geocentric model, for all the reasons I pointed out with the epicycles, is a complete mess. There's no evidence of the geocentric model apart from the Earth-Moon system looks, well, I mean, it literally is geocentric, and the Earth-Sun system can look geocentric from Earth because that's how observations between two things work. I'm sorry, but what is this? The church is allowed to have a dogma based on zero evidence, and Galileo's not allowed to have an opinion when he has a model that fixes discrepancies like retrograde motion? What is this? The church's opinion on the Earth's position relative to other things is scripturally inspired, not inspired by observations, and they explicitly declare that observations, we don't give a fuck about them.
This is a big deal. There is no proof for the heliocentric hypothesis.
There's arguments, but not.
What is this guy saying? No, Galileo's observations of the phases of Venus was extremely strong proof of a heliocentric model. We really need to put our imagination caps on here, but here's a geocentric model. The only way for Venus to be fully illuminated, like the full moon, is to be opposite of the sun. That is an enormous problem because Venus, in fact, is fully illuminated when it is directly in line with the sun from our perspective. This doesn't work. I'm sorry, but your Galileo expert is an ignoramus that just doesn't understand a solar system. You can't just regurgitate the mantra, there was no evidence, there was no evidence, there was no evidence, and then just declare victory. Look at the models and realize that only one model actually works.
Treat it as a hypothesis, you won't have any problems. Present it as a
which is exactly what Galileo did.
theory, I'm using modern terminology. Present it as truth, as a theory, you're going to have problems with the church.
Which is not what Galileo did. But again, the church's position was you are not allowed to even discuss it. He did treat it as hypothetical. I think we're going to get into that very shortly here.
If somebody should find proof,
it wouldn't matter because it's contrary to the dogma, to the scripture.
for this hypothesis, then we will have to reinterpret scripture.
That happened, but it took decades and decades and decades. There's also a very famous letter that Galileo wrote to Johannes Kepler, where he said that these men close their eyes to the light of truth. He told people, he invited people, look through my telescope, see the things that I have seen, and they just flat out refused.
Carefully.
It's very reasonable. He actually says, look, if you just said it then, if proof could be shown of this, then yeah, we'd have to reinterpret some points of scripture. But he said, but no such demonstration has been shown to me.
Yeah.
Just flat out false. There were demonstrations of it. The geocentric model is crap. They didn't believe in geocentrism because of the observations, but because of their interpretation of scripture. And I'm repeating myself so much. They explicitly said you're not allowed to even talk about it, which means there's no gathering evidence for it if you're not allowed to even talk about it. And it doesn't matter what your opinion in your data says because it can never be true if it's contrary to the scriptures.
Exactly what we should expect when it comes to science. Hypothesis is fine, but until you can prove it, then we're not going to change 1,000 years of thinking.
You would know this and you wouldn't be making all these mistakes if you had watched this interview like I told you to do back in 2023.
Okay, I've seen apparently all the relative parts here, and yeah, those guys are completely wrong. They're wrong about the data, they're wrong about the church's position on the dogma.
In fact, the full interview debunks all the misinformation you spread in your video on the Galileo affair.
Oh, for crying out loud. So that Galileo video I did is 10 minutes long, and he's only going to talk about just a few parts of it. I did not... there is no misinformation in my video.
But I'll hit some of the highlights for you.
The Copernican model is extremely accurate. That's not misinformation, that's true. Here's Mars' orbit. Here's a perfect circle over top of it. Why is he including this? You can't tell the difference because while the orbits are elliptical, they are extremely slight in their eccentricity.
And neither Copernicus nor Galileo could explain this in terms of physics in their day.
I addressed that in my video.
That was the problem.
Kepler's elliptical orbits don't address anything either. It's just a declarative statement of the observations. The key observation in both models is the planets orbit the sun. Yeah, before we go any further, he didn't address anything about the church faking their letter. He didn't address anything about the church's official position on the dogma of the scriptures and evidence be damned. None of that.
Most people don't realize this, but at the time, the science was on the church's side.
No, it wasn't. I don't know what this could possibly mean, and there was no elaboration. There was just throwing up of book.
It means what I said. There was no physics at the time to explain how a heliocentric model could work.
There was no physics at the time for how a geocentric model would work. The church's problem wasn't about science.
The historian Robert S. Westman did a survey of writers from that time and found that only about 11 accepted a Copernican model. Pietro Daniel Amodio's survey
Yeah, they were dogmatic thinkers.
Found similar results. They point out the vast majority.
Scientists, like in the 20th century, the vast majority of scientists rejected that the sun is made predominantly of hydrogen, that plate tectonics is, well, they rejected Alfred Wegener's interpretation of his hypothesis of continental drift. They rejected it despite the overwhelming evidence in support of it. Now, again, you can argue until the theory of plate tectonics was around and before we sonar mapped the ocean floor and saw the mid-ocean ridges, then scientists began to change their mind. But that's like saying you have all but 15 pieces of a puzzle, and it's a puzzle of an elephant, and some guy goes, look, I mean, we think it's a tiger, and we're missing 1% of the puzzle. So for you to say it's an elephant.
They point out the vast majority of experts at the time rejected the Copernican model because the physics didn't support it.
Oh, there were no experts in physics in 1633. Holy shit.
When elliptical models were developed using the work of Newton and Kepler, the church and the experts accepted them with ease.
No, they didn't. The church accepted heliocentrism in 1822. That's over 200 years after Kepler. And again, a heliocentric model with elliptical orbits is just a model demonstrating what we observe. A Copernican model is the same thing, and they are very, very close to indistinguishable from each other.
Because the science finally supported them.
Why was Tycho a famous and prolific astronomer? He wasn't toiling and dwelling in the underground. He was well known. Why was he not condemned and put on trial for his scientifically false model?
Because he didn't treat his hypothesis as a proven fact, and he didn't insult the Pope, his own patron, in a...
Aha! Before I go on, I'm going to go ahead and say that I made a little bit of a blunder here. I also talk about why wasn't Kepler punished by the church. Kepler and Tycho lived in regions of Europe that were Protestant. The Inquisition had no jurisdiction there. Jones didn't bring this up. That's a pretty bad oversight on both of our parts, but, it's my argument, so especially on me. However, I did explicitly bring up that Tycho's writings were never banned by the church, whereas they did ban Galileo and Copernicus's book. Although they allowed Copernicus's book to be published, but it had to be censored. But this thing about the Pope, so I think this is important context, but it really has nothing to do with the point of the argument. In Galileo's fictional book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, or whatever, there's a character defending heliocentrism and a character defending geocentrism. Now, I didn't include this in my video because my video is already 10 minutes long and it doesn't really matter for the science. But the person defending geocentrism in Galileo's book is depicted as kind of a moron, and it was also kind of clear that that character was modeled after the Pope. Now, we can't really know if the Inquisition really went down on him for insulting the Pope, but if we're going to heavily lean into that, that doesn't help you at all, Jones. That just further says that it doesn't have anything to do with the science. Also, are we really defending that the church would destroy somebody's life like that for writing a satirical fictional book in where the Pope is one of the characters is inspired by the Pope?
Galileo got in trouble because he was teaching the Copernican model as if it was a proven fact, when it was only an hypothesis.
Let's pretend this isn't false, which it is. Right.
No, that's the truth. You should have looked at my sources.
I looked at your sources, and I looked at other sources, and he was sentenced for heresy. He was not sentenced for bad science, and they said science be damned. That is what they said at their sentencing. If they changed their mind over decades and decades, irrelevant to what his actual sentencing was for. And again, according to the church, which this was a lie in the context of Bellarmine's letter, but it doesn't matter because it was the justification for putting him to trial and everything. According to the church, it wasn't allowed to be discussed at all. You must refrain from even mentioning it. And his book was a fictional narrative. One character in his book defends a position, the other character in the book defends the dogma.
And he used that book to insult the Pope, his own patron.
Doesn't give them the right to put him under house arrest for life.
Which got him in trouble, as James Hannam says.
So did he get in trouble for insulting the Pope or for having bad science?
But what in fact Galileo did was he wrote a book which comprehensively debunked Greek cosmology in favour of Copernicus.
I'm sorry, did your source just say that Galileo comprehensively debunked Greek astronomy? Cosmology, whatever. You really have a way of pulling on sources that don't back up your claim. I could hinge my entire argument just on that quote alone. According to your source, Galileo did prove that the geocentric model is false.
And then at the end of it, he compounded his error by including an argument that the Pope himself had given him in the mouth of the person who in the book is really the fool. He's the fool guy. And the Pope clearly was not going to tolerate that.
When elliptical models could be developed from the work of Newton and Kepler, the church accepted it with ease, because the physics advanced enough to support it.
Advanced? Galileo's trial occurred decades after Kepler published his laws. You have the order of events wrong, but just listen to this dribble. Should be drivel. Somebody roasted me for saying that. It's drivel, not dribble. I've always thought, I'm pretty sure people back home say dribble, and I always thought of it like I picture like a drooling moron saying stuff. So that's my ignorant Midwest roots coming out.
No, buddy, because you have the order of events wrong.
No, I don't. Okay, what's the argument?
When Kepler published his laws, they weren't immediately proven, because Kepler's second law wasn't proven until the 1670s. After that, heliocentrism took off because the physics was finally there to support it.
The point I was making was that why didn't the church ban any of Kepler's works, and why didn't they ban any of Tycho's writings? Because if Galileo is wrong, then so is Kepler. Now, Newton comes around after Galileo has died. The work of Newton, it didn't fix Kepler's laws or anything like that. It just solidified it into equations. There was no reason to reject Kepler's elliptical heliocentric model before Newton. Newton helped, but again, it wasn't required or necessary. Galileo didn't invent the concept of gravity, but he did prove that, like, he's the one that figured out it's 9.8 meters per second squared. Nobody rejected that. It's a much simpler thing to accept because you can see it happening right in front of you, I guess. But again, the models, they're just models of reality. You don't need a computer, you don't need calculus, you don't need Isaac Newton to prove that the heliocentric model is correct. And again, the discrepancy on elliptical versus circular orbits is so microscopic. It is not something to rest the argument on, because both models are heliocentric.
And you would know all this and wouldn't be peddling this misinformation if you had looked at
that's so ironic.
the sources I already gave you.
I mean, I've looked at them now and they're just horrible. Again, those experts you showed me, they're complete. They haven't spent any time even thinking about the differences in the two models, if they would say that. And they're deeply ignorant about the work of Galileo. Again, the Copernican model fixes the epicycles with a simple and parsimonious model. It describes the phases of Venus as well. Galileo also proved that Jupiter has moons, so not everything in the universe orbited the Earth. This is the only thing I'm going to do in response to this. These back and forths, they just get nauseating. But I'll say it again, I think that was a woefully inadequate response to both of the videos I made. You still really didn't address the book burning thing. You did bring up that the other author said it, but you ginned up context about why you didn't say anything about it, completely left out all the other examples I gave. You just simply won't openly discuss it happening. It's odd. And again, the Galileo thing, you're regurgitating other people's narrative around it without using any of the words of the Inquisition. You put up that letter that I think came from Bellarmine, but we have once again completely glossed over all of the facts that he was underlying that his sentencing was due to heresy and that it had fuck all to do with science. And again, I don't know if you're lying or you just don't get it, but saying that Galileo disobeyed his orders, he didn't. He wrote a fictional book, and then you kind of honestly said, yeah, and he got in trouble for making fun of the Pope. I'm sorry, I thought he got in trouble for having bad science and peddling something as a fact. No, even though he didn't disobey his orders, he made fun of the Pope, and so they made an example out of him. You're not very good at nicknames, you're still obfuscating and failing to acknowledge the facts, and you have the history and the science wrong. Other than that, I mean, the music was cute, I guess.